If you were an 80s kid, a 90s teen, or an adult in the late 90s, you know the thrill of finding treasure where nobody else saw it. Whether it was a milk crate of comics at a yard sale, a Hot Wheels red line in a flea market bin, or a VHS tape you knew no one else in your friend group had. Now, for me, that moment came in 1985 with a quarter and a worn out copy of this book, Arnold's Bodybuilding for Men. Now, I was almost 10 years old, and I was convinced that this bodybuilding Bible held the secrets of the universe. Now, over the years, I read it so obsessively that the pages started tearing, and I lugged that thing around from home to home, storage box to storage box, city to city, until 2022 when I finally donated it to a local Goodwill. Now, maybe you had your own Arnold book, that one thing that got you into collecting and kept you moving from yard to yard because it was the thing that was going to complete your set, or maybe it was going to be the cornerstone to start your next collection. And maybe like me, you learn how to hustle early, mowing lawns, selling candy, or running errands for a couple of bucks, all to fund the hunt. Now, every weekend was another shot at finding something amazing, right? Something that made you feel like the coolest kid in the neighborhood. My dad and I scoured garage sales and flea markets every weekend, and soon I was carrying home milk crates brimming with comic books, top sports cards, and those beautiful garbage pail kids. And if you were a kid in the mid 80s, you remember the contraband thrill of trading those cards under a desk before a teacher swooped in. They were like classroom and playground currency, right? Now, did you know that Garbage Pail Kids were an instant sensation when they first came out? Topps launched the first Garbage Pail Kids series in 1985, poking fun at the Cabbage Patch craze with gross out humor. By 1988, they cranked out 15 different series and even a short lived movie. And what a terrible movie it was, but I sure love the VHS sleeve and the poster. Teachers hated them and kids loved them, so they became the contraband gem of every schoolyard. We thought nothing of it at the time, but in retrospect, I see how that era taught me to value the things that made me feel good. And honestly, GPK cards did that for me. And they're still really collectible and popular. But please don't let anyone convince you that they're rare. Millions of them were printed. Now, Topps was printing at junk wax levels by 1986, similar to most of the other card makers of that era. And sets like the 1987 Topps Baseball had estimated print runs of over 2 to 3 million cards per card design. And GPK was similarly popular. So the only series with moderately lower print run is the first series. But you know that didn't matter, right? I mean, cards were really magical in those days. Sports cards were really special. Remember ripping open a pack of Topps or Fleer and hoping, your favorite player card was inside? By the way, we never referred to any cards as key at that time. That's a modern speculative term. And in 1989, card companies started pushing new boundaries with glossy designs. Upper Deck's rookie card of Ken Griffey Jr. was printed on glossy stock, and anyone who got one basically felt like a millionaire. Now, here's something interesting. We didn't know it then, but Upper Deck printed over 1 million copies of that Griffey card. In fact, later insider accounts, including former Upper Deck employees, suggested closer to 2 million copies of the Griffey rookie were produced. If you collected back then, you probably had at least one Griffey in your binder, or 20. And for this reason, I won't stop cautioning these Pokemon collectors to go easy on the hobby. They're printing billions of Pokemon cards today. But back to sports cards for a quick second. There were so many rookies. You needed a wheelbarrow to carry all those cards, right? Everything else was just common. Oof, did I just say wheelbarrow? I think I did. Does that age me? I've got to ask my kids if they even know what that is. I'm sure it ages me. Still, as a kid, I remember hunting everywhere for Griffey Jr., Frank Thomas, Jose Canseco, Mark McGuire, Sammy Sosa. Any chance I could hit gold with any of those cards, or at least the guarantee of bubble gum. By my early teens, I had folders full of baseball cards and boxes of comics. I also had a bunch of Beckett magazines because thanks to them and Wizard Magazine, cards and comics were no longer just for reading. They were an investment. Those were really the days, you guys. You remember that? You could get really cheap stuff. And we had no idea what would happen to collecting thanks to, eBay and other auction sites a few years later. All right, so the 90s hit and everything was different. The collectibles market exploded or imploded, depending on how you look at it. And as a teenager, I dived into movies and toys. I became enamored with those Criterion Collection films, the special editions and with all the commentary. And Criterion had started releasing important movies on Laserdisc as early as 1984. So they were a big name. Yeah, so I was into like Akira Kurosawa and John Woo and all the black and white movies that Criterion was putting out. Now, when I look back, I think I spent a ton of money on those things. Now, I was still collecting comics and cards, but I was also amping up the toy collection at that time, probably closer to the mid 90s. My best friend and I we would go to San Diego Comic-Con in those days, so I would dig for comics, Transformers, GI Joes, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Hot Wheels, and anything with a backstory or that limited edition stamp on it. My room was starting to look like a museum. By the way, remember in the early days of going to Comic Cons, there used to be quarter boxes, 50 cents boxes, if I recall correctly, and those dollar boxes. What I would give to be able to go back in time and pick out some of those things that I passed up. All right, so here's an audience question. Maybe you had your own collecting lane back then. What was it? I want to know. VHS horror tapes, Star Wars toys, McFarlane action figures. Let everyone know in the comments. All right, so you might be wondering, how in the world was I funding all of this? Well, I used to resell candy at school, and I got really good at trading up for things. For a number of years, I would take comics to the convention to trade or for credit. And at one point, I got my hands on an Incredible Hulk 181. It was in terrible condition, so I traded it a few years later at Comic-Con for a TMNT #1. Not a bad trade-up if I do say so myself. The TMNT book is far rarer than the Hulk 181. But for some reason, everyone wants that Hulk 181. Must be the Wolverine, right? But, then I think we all can recall that the media hype basically was spectacular. Everything was bubbling up at that time, and it wasn't something that shocked us. By the mid 90s, I started growing cynical like a lot of you. And what was once fun became a chore. And I decided I didn't want to keep throwing my money away. In comics, every issue was stuffed with multiple variant covers, foil embossing, holograms, you name it. And Marvel and DC really tried to sucker us in, and they were successful. And I swear, by 1994, you needed a spreadsheet to track alternate covers. And the mainstream media, I mean, don't even get me started with those guys. They were going crazy reporting on comic books as investments. They touted like, they would say Action Comics #1 sold for $1 million. And suddenly every kid thought every comic could be worth millions someday. So we bought 3 copies, 1 for reading and 2 for investment. I won't even say how many Darker Image copies I have. It's really embarrassing. 8. The number is 8. And it didn't help that the publishers were literally trying to bamboozle us. I mean, during the 90s, publishers pandered to the collector's market with gimmicks like polybagged issues, glow-in-the-dark covers, and holographic cards glued on the covers. You guys remember those? These variants were purely cosmetic, by the way, yet they were still successful in convincing us that they were grails. Our local comic shop shelves bent under the weight of shiny special editions. I kid you not, they really did. And my wallet was almost always empty. And sports cards went through a similar bubble. My friends and I collected baseball, basketball, wrestling, and various other cards like movie cards until we saw prices started to skyrocket. Beckett guides were temple scripture basically at that time, and they would tell us what every rookie card was supposed to fetch. And I swear we were treating cards like futures, okay, like on the stock market. And I believed wholeheartedly they were going to go up in value and keep going up. I had stacks of cards earmarked for various trades or sales. And the truth is, the hobby collapsed under its own weight. There was so much greed on the part of card makers who printed so much product that it diluted the hobby. Collecting became second. The more baseball cards that were printed, the less each was worth. And it took a while for that to kind of sink in up here. Dealers were hawking boxes like crazy back then. Do you ever walk into a baseball card shop and instead of trying to sell you a baseball card, they were trying to sell you the actual box? Man, by 1996, we were so burned out from oversaturation of printed cardboard. By the late 1990s, I realized comics and cards were dead. The next decade wasn't going to be great. So I hid everything in boxes and slowly started forgetting about them. Now, the 2000s, frankly, they were a blur. They were college and just living life. I had a lot less time for, racks of shiny paper. I chased girls, played sports, and was working on my degree. My Nintendo 64 and my PlayStation replaced my need for cards, and I'd occasionally wander into a comic shop, smelling that comic book scent, flipping through the old Marvel back issues. But it all felt like a dream from childhood. And by that time, sports card shops in San Diego, they mostly vanished. The end of the century crash was brutal. Industry reports, if I recall, they showed that cards had plunged from something like $1.2 billion in 1991 to just around $400 million by 1999. And, the faces on the cards, they kept changing. There were new athletes, different types of makers, but fewer people were buying. And so many stores at that point had just closed down. And I think you've all felt like this, but you have probably gone somewhere in your town and walked by a storefront that used to be like a bustling card shop or comic book store. And it was replaced by a hair salon, or like in my case, one of the places was replaced by a police department. It was crazy. And honestly, we can't be blamed for this, for what happened. Essentially, the industry self-imploded. And for me, I quietly stepped away from collecting much of anything entirely. Movies dominated the culture, right? Remember how like The Dark Knight Returns, Watchmen, and The Death of Superman, they were like really huge comic books. And we started to see them in theaters or on our televisions, in cartoons and things like that. And, I will say that even without actively hunting, I still ended up with some graphic novels here and there, a few reprints, collected issues. And I was just became a casual comic book collector, baseball card collector. I think that I just basically stopped with sports cards, completely for a while. But I was occasionally buying comic books. And I don't know about you. Were you doing that? Were you into one thing and not the other, or just completely stopped entirely? But I just know that like by the time I was in college, collecting, it really took a back seat while real life took the wheel. Hey guys, talking about all this, it really reminds me of why I wrote Nostalgia Nation, the definitive chronicle of growing up Gen X. It's basically the scrapbook of our childhood and shared memories. And it's exactly what I'm talking about here. The toys, the trends, the card collecting, the comic book collecting, pop culture moments that shaped us, historical things that shaped us and allow us to share these memories together. And you know what? If you've ever found yourself saying while watching one of my previous videos, like, oh, I remember that, or if you just want to time travel back to the greatest time to be a kid, you're probably going to love this book. And I wrote it for you. So Nostalgia Nation is available right now on paperback and ebook on Amazon, and as an ebook on Apple Books. The link is going to be in the description below. All right, so the mid 2010s, basically I got the itch to reignite the old flame, right? The collecting flame. Nostalgia is a powerful drug, you guys. And I started poking around comic book shops and record stores and tried to find baseball card shops around. But man, I got to tell you, the world I came back to was totally different. It was as if kid me walked into a Wall Street trading floor by mistake. And, collectibles, they were no longer just passion projects. They were highly commoditized. Even worse than back in the 80s and 90s. Now, sports card values were spiking again thanks to modern rookies and the internet and gambling, right? No one talks about the impact of gambling and being able to use gambling apps, including fantasy leagues, and how that's changed the collectibles market, especially the sports card market, you guys. Gambling and sports card flipping or speculation, they're like married. And don't you find it interesting that during the pandemic, which was the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression, that sports card sales demolished all-time records? That's right. While the world was on lockdown, eBay and auction houses were bursting at the seams with speculators in flannel shirts, okay? Now, not coincidentally, drug abuse and gambling was like at an all-time peak as well. I really couldn't believe it. Facebook groups and YouTube were full of videos of people breaking boxes of cards live on camera. Every rookie quarterback in Panini Prism or Topps Chrome was treated like Bitcoin, and it felt like 1993 all over again. This time, it was turbocharged, and it was turbocharged by pandemic boredom and easy money that was coming in, right? People were collecting money at that time. And I remember this really being evident on social media because I would see accounts pop up left and right that were posting all of, their new collection, things that they just bought recently. Young people that had zero experience with the collectibles of the past were actually buying them up now because they just felt a a desire to collect old things. And so everything was starting to creep up in price, and it was becoming far more difficult to find things at a reasonable cost and add to my own collection. And it's funny. I remember a friend of mine, they started cracking open Pokemon and Magic the Gathering and baseball boxes on Twitch. People were losing their minds over Pokemon, and I was just blown away about what was happening. Now, comics too, they had entered a weird new phase, and it seemed like the only comics worth anything were high grade key issues in slabs, right? Every other cover was being sent to CGC for a 9.8 or greater. And dealers would like trade these comics back and forth like poker chips. And I dropped by a shop only to see stacks of slabs, silver and bronze age issues with price stickers that felt like mortgage payments. Now, the idea of reading a comic felt almost foreign. I, I I mentally shifted my own mindset. I had to, and I was like not going to become a flipper, okay? But like here's the thing, like collectors are sometimes flippers too. And I used to trade up for books back in the day. And now I just would have to make very discerning buying decisions. You can't get into comics today without, straddling two different worlds, and one driven by pure storytelling and your enjoyment of reading, and the other basically by relentless speculation. Unless you plan to stick strictly to collected editions in like trade paperbacks or digital, and basically steer clear from the hype machine entirely. And it got to the point where I considered calling it quits for good. I mean, good, right? And like all the joy of collecting was overshadowed by hype and like the grind of market tracking. And like my inner Gen Xer like sniffed out this absurdity. Like I could spot it. And like our hobby turned into a casino, and I was like part of playing this losing game like everyone else was, right? Except unless you were a whale and you could afford to lose money and take a chance, right? And just when I thought I was out, and just when I thought I was about to toss the whole thing into the dumpster of life, something pulled me back in a much gentler way. And you guys, I got to tell you, it was vinyl. Vinyl records. Collecting albums in the early 2020s was like going on a journey and a wild treasure hunt. There was an art and a ritual to it. I want you to imagine this, like you're browsing racks in like dusty shops, examining cover art, laying the record on the turntable and letting it crackle when you get home. It was oddly therapeutic. And I found that like getting a used Tears for Fears or Prince album out of its sleeve was like more satisfying than any PSA grading label I ever craved. Albums were bringing that joy back again for me. And you know what's crazy? And I think the pandemic had something to do with this too, but like vinyl had become popular again. For context, in 2022, Americans bought over 41 million records, more than the number of CDs sold that year. And vinyl revenue even topped $1.2 billion, the 16th straight year of growth for vinyl. And for the first time since 1987, albums outsold CDs in units. So like this wasn't a niche or anything. Like people were loving physical music again. It was awesome. I started buying CDs and albums when I could, yet even vinyl collecting wasn't immune to the big hobbies habits and things. You could spot these things. So like a few years ago, a few new grading companies started popping up, and they announced that they were going to start grading music now, like CDs, tapes, and vinyl, VHS tapes, and things like that. So they were like showing off all their like music encapsulation services, and people were eating it up. Things were being posted on like reseller sites that were like VHS tapes were selling for thousands of dollars. Video games were selling for thousands of dollars. And I'm like, but you can't play them anymore. Like, what's happening here? So the hype men, right, we're saying like, we're basically calling this the opportunity to jump into the most exciting new vertical. And basically it was physical media and grading physical media. Now, this was the same playbook we were seeing with cards and comics, right? Once grading started catching up with um, a little bit more stabilization in the collectible card market and the comic book market, things sort of took off. And, sure enough, as soon as grading enters any scene like this, um, prices start to go up. A sealed Beatles album, I think the Butcher cover album went for something like $125,000. A Bob Dylan album was selling for like $150,000 at auction. And there were like other albums that were like really not a big deal, like Def Leppard. I mean, you could find them. I don't mean not big deal because Def Leppard is a big deal, but you could find those items, those albums regularly for 20, $30 max, but they were selling for over $100 to $200, right? I mean, obviously condition plays a huge part, but everything had started to go up in physical media as well. Now that has slowed down a little bit today, sure. But every once in a while, I'll catch that, like hardcore speculative thing happening on auction sites. Just can't help it. My eye kind of goes to that stuff. Now, the difference with vinyl was speed, right? The sell-through rate. Records move far slower than most other collectibles. So even like rarer titles, they'll often sit for months before selling. And, the frenzy wasn't nearly as immediate as when like a shiny new quarterback came out and that rookie card drops and everybody wants to, find it, like in a pack. So I think the big thing is like dealers in the vinyl world, they're far more laid back. And maybe that's because like we just actually want to listen to the music. And I certainly wasn't going to pay hundreds for a used Beastie Boys double album when I could like stream it for free on one of my high-end digital players. So like vinyl collecting taught me some patience and helped me see collecting itself in a far healthier light. And so my buying frequency had slowed, and I was really starting to go through a lot of my collectibles that I already own. Then eventually, like I realized something very important, and I really hope this helps you. Like I had a collection that was huge in scope, but like disorganized in purpose. Does that make sense? Like, have you guys thought about your collection as a whole and what it means to you? So, like, that helped me kind of like push away the FOMO and avoid it. And then, like, start enjoying what I truly cared about, the stuff that I had. I began going through my collection one segment at a time with like a focus on memories rather than like its market value. Now, like, I'm still in the process of parting with boxes of cards and comics that like no longer mean as much to me. And in their place, like I'm going to keep a handful of items in my personal collection that like really tie me to like a core memory, like that worn out Arnold book, And yeah, I'm definitely going to keep a few comics that like I loved reading and that probably have more spine ticks than like it would make a speculator cringe, right? And you probably know this, like it's like that feeling for the thing that I'm going to keep. When you pull that thing out of a box or out of storage, it instantly transports you like tactile, the smell, the place you were in at the time. That's really what you're looking for when you keep that in your personal collection. And that I needed to learn that, and I needed to really get to that level. And you know what? Like letting go feels surprisingly good. And it also clears things up physically and mentally. Like it turns out that by decluttering my things, it's helped me psychologically in so many ways. I really believe like organizing and getting rid of some of your belongings can be like a satisfying way to feel better and can cultivate gratitude and mindfulness. And like just in plain terms, I feel a great joy when I like can walk up and go to my closet, open it up, and like know exactly where things are. Like just being as organized as I can. That's been part of that process. Now my collection feels like a curated thing rather than something that I'm burying away and not looking at for a long time. But like I said, I'm still working on this, so it's not like I've reached like this Zen thing or nirvana or something. I've relapsed actually a few times, and it's a process. But I'd love to know if you've done this or have thought about doing this, and if you're in the thick of it like I am. Yeah, of course, I still get the occasional itch to snag a new comic, or pull a pack of cards from a shelf while I'm grocery shopping or whatever. But that feeling is different now. It's not about like the FOMO or expecting a windfall, like pulling gold or something. It's like a kidified glint of the past, and like having taken a step back, I'm no longer like trying to get rich quick or expecting something more from my collection. It's just about the satisfaction I have for it, right? I remember why all of this started in the first place, for the joy of the hunt, the nostalgia of childhood, the stories and memories tied to these treasures, right? My journey through the ups and downs of collecting has been my own crash course in economics, culture, and frankly, like folly. So like when I think back about that garage sale gold that I got from like Arnold's Bodybuilding for Men, and to like my resignation in the mid 2010s or whatever from collecting, I've seen the collectible world from every angle. And like I know these untold stories, or these told stories now, are not just mine. Like I know that you all have experienced them. You've gone through the ups and downs of collecting. And I like to see the silver lining. Like, yeah, a lot of us rode the hype train, but we still live to tell the tale, right? If there's one thing, I hope someone takes away from this, it's this: like, collect what you love, not what's trendy, and enjoy your collection in your own terms. And another thing is, like, get organized. Love on your collection. When you know what you have, it makes you remember things. It makes you feel good about those times. And then you know where to find those things and whether they're going to be of value to you, of joy to you. And if they're not, you can just offload them. Because, like, in the end, the best souvenirs aren't the slabbed items you never look at, or the things that's, some talking head says is hot this week, right? They're the memories and satisfaction you keep from, like, the thrill of the hunt and the people and the places and what they were tied to. And the last thing I'll say is, don't let them burden you. The whole idea of collecting for me should be one that is not grinding at you, not stressing you out, not making you lose opportunities with your family and your friends, and just moving forward with your life. Your collection should be an extension of your history, and something to look at and to look back on with pride and with joy, right? So don't ever let your things hold you down. And honestly, for me, since having started organizing and getting back into what I actually own, I've been starting to share it with my kids. And my kids have been asking me a lot of questions about things that they see in my collection. And for me, that has brought out so much joy out of my collection. It makes me so happy to be able to share that with my own children. And honestly, I hope that's something that you can experience too. You know, share them with someone you love and care about. All right. On that note, I want you to tell me, like, what was your favorite era of collecting, and what did you love collecting? Comics, cards, toys, physical media. Remember to comment below. I love reading your comments, and I will comment back. All right, you guys. So that's it for today's trip down memory lane. And if you had a good time hanging out in the past with me, hit that like button. It lets me know that you're digging this content and you appreciate it. And hey, if you want a daily dose of nostalgia, make sure you're following me on Instagram at that 80s dude. Until next time, keep collecting what you love and stay rad.